Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Hemp Grower Spotlight. I am your host, commercial agriculture educator, Phillip Alberti. This webinar series will serve as a platform for our local producers and allow other growers and agribusiness professionals to come together to discuss agriculture. Knowing the ins and outs of this industry before getting involved will be critical to success, and so a large portion of the program will focus on the lessons learned with regards to planting methods, fertility, harvesting, storage, and extraction. Today's episode, we will be talking with Northwestern Illinois producer Andy Huston of American Hemp Research in Roseville, Illinois. Throughout the educational program, participants will be allowed to contribute to a live Q&A with our guests, and the webinar will be posted online at go.illinois/spotlight shortly following the program. You will notice at the top right of your screen there is a QR code. That is a link to our survey and a program evaluation which tells us how we did and how we can improve to better serve you, our stakeholders. So with that, let's get started. Before we delve a little bit deeper into each aspect of production, Andy, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your operation and why hemp.
Well, like Phil said, thanks, Phil, for having me here today. Appreciate it. Phil kind of went by that me and my brother farm here in West Central Illinois, and then we worked with Western Illinois University to get a research project started for hemp in 2018, and with the U.S. Farm Bill that was signed in 2018 and Illinois legalizing hemp, we were hoping to get in somewhat on the ground floor in hemp production in Illinois. Since I'm a farmer, I've been farming for pretty much my whole life. So I've got about 30 years experience farming. And last year, what we basically did was we incorporated some of the techniques we use in Colorado and Oregon, some of the standard techniques. We use those in Illinois. We're trying to figure out ways to grow hemp as economically as possible here in Illinois.
What was the biggest reason for you getting into industrial hemp, considering your background in traditional row crop?
The main focus has been, ever since the beginning, I think Illinois, we need another crop that we can, another viable commodity that we can grow in the Midwest that will give farmers an option, so when corn and soybean prices aren't that good, that they've got a third crop that they might be able to put in there. But my main focus is basically to hopefully bring in some more economic stability to the Midwest. And I hope hemp can do that. We don't know yet, but it's a brand new industry, so it's still exciting.
So really just looking to diversify your cropping system was a reason for getting in.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. What were the thoughts that went into your mind about how are we going to actually accomplish this from a budget perspective, and maybe where did you go to get some information on budgeting, price points, things of that nature, so you could prepare yourself?
Universities now have worked up a budget where you can go in there and it'll pretty much give you a line item of expenditures that you can put into the crop.
Examples like Kentucky and Tennessee, for example.
Yeah, those are good references. You can grow hemp on about any budget, really. It just depends on how big you want to go. And I mean, you can get, as far as seeds are going to be your biggest input cost getting started. If you have access to farm ground, that's going to be beneficial. We're not going to do as much this year as what we did last year. And our main focus for that is to try to keep our labor costs down as much as we can this year. So prices of biomass are a lot lower than what they were this time last year. So you basically have to adjust to the market and hope for the best.
So reducing labor costs, what does that look like to you? Is that making things more mechanical where you can? Is that decreasing acreage to find something that's a little bit more suitable for you? Where are you thinking of mitigating labor force?
The majority of what we're going to do for extractions, we're going to do with autoflower. And autoflowers are a lot smaller. They don't get nearly as tall, so we move our row width into about 36-inch rows. And then we plant instead of planting around 2,000 seeds the acre, we're going to be planting closer to 10,000. And with that, there's going to be several advantages, we think, because we're going to be able to move our planting date ahead so we can plant into May where we have better soil moisture germination. And it's going to let us do our harvest in August instead of having to do it in October. we're in a little bit different scenario because we're basically running our own biomass, and what we produced last summer, we have a lot of biomass on hand. So for right now, what we're going to grow this summer, we'll probably end up marketing part of it and then keeping part of it here on the farm for doing our own processing. I recommend you can spend up to maybe $2,000 to $3,000 an acre in input costs putting in hemp, or you can spend up to $15,000 an acre putting in hemp. It just depends on how you do it. If you go with seedlings, irrigation, those type of expenses add up.
Any online sources or things like that that you would recommend to anybody looking to get involved in hemp?
Colorado State has been really good. They've got a lot of good information as far as pesticides that are labeled that we put on hemp.
You kind of have a different background. You've done both. But what were some of the factors in your mind when making field selections?
You repeat that very last part. You kind of cut out on me, Phil.
Sure. Just what were the biggest factors when deciding this is where we're going to put our hemp crop?
Basically, for field selection, I would pick well-drained soil. I would use your better soils that you have, and try to find a field that has the least amount of weed pressure in it. Because without being able to use any herbicides on there, the weeding has to be done mechanically. And if your field's fairly clean to begin with, it's gonna be a benefit to you throughout the growing season. So that's definitely what I would do on field selection. Having a good water source nearby never hurts anything either. So whether that's a pond, a creek, or a hydrant. Sometimes these plants need a little bit of water especially when you're doing transplants. And once they go, usually within the first week to 2 weeks that they're in the field, depending on how hot and dry it is outside, you're going to definitely have to get some water on those plants until the root system gets established in the soil.
You had traditionally the same in the same field, direct seeded plants and transplants, if we want to call it the same field. What did you see in terms of performance, maybe within varieties, or just kind of noticeably from comparing a direct seeded field to one that uses transplants and plasticulture with raised beds? What did you see there from a plant health standpoint and productivity?
What we saw in our field last year was the plants that went in directly seeded, their root system was throughout the entire growing season was a lot better than the stuff that we transplanted. And we had hemp that we basically transplanted in the field, and we started those seeds out in the flats at the same time we directly seeded into the field. So those plants, the seeds actually hit dirt the same day. If you went 30 days out from the time that those plants, the ones that got directly seeded versus the ones that got transplanted, the direct seedings were leaps and bounds ahead of the transplants all year long. One thing, granted, last year was our first year doing transplants. We transplanted about 100,000 seedlings, and we had a death loss on our transplants probably around 1% at most. So it was very minimal when we took the plants and put them out. Most of them, lived and thrived and did well. But there's just a delay period that you're going to run into doing transplants, because when they come out of the greenhouse and they go out in the field, there's about a week to 10-day period where the plants are pretty much don't put on any vegetative growth. They just pretty much sit there, and they're waiting to get their root system down into the soil, and then that's when you'll start seeing them growing above the soil after that. The field looked good last year on transplants, but it goes back to the budgeting issue. It's just so much cheaper and easier to go out there with a planter and direct seed into the ground, but there's a risk involved in there. If you end up if you get a bad rain or something that would happen to crush that soil, you might end up with a port emergence coming out.
Did you do any soil testing on the field prior to planting, discussing things like heavy metals, and then from a fertility standpoint, but also things like residual pesticides and herbicides? Were any of those in consideration after selecting where you're going to plant?
What we did is we put our hemp on a field where we had non-GMO products, and we have not had any pesticide residue show up in our hemp. The heavy metals, I think the biggest issues from that is if you're going to try to plant your hemp in a field that maybe at some point in time wasn't a commercial production field. You know, I have a lot of people that come to me that are saying, I've got 2 acres on my farm. I would like to put some hemp in. If you don't know the whole history of that farm, you just might want to make sure that you'll run into different stuff. You know, that there could have been a building site there back in the 50s or 60s where people might have stored something that got into the soil. Stuff like that you just might want to be aware of. But
what was your fertilization strategy like for hemp here, given that we don't really have recommendations for CBD specific hemp?
we put on the same fertilizer ratio as we would if we were planting a wheat field. I think hemp basically likes to have the nitrogen early in the season, and when it's doing the flowering and putting on the oil, that's when it likes potash.
You can look to some of the work that was done at Cornell or even Colorado, and there was a lot of concern regarding fertility influencing cannabinoid production in these plants. And the research out there is starting to suggest that it's really not so much a fertility, but a stress or a genotype by environment interaction. So we need more research to be done, but really it's looking like stress and environmental conditions are what we really need to be aware of with hemp. So field selection, fertility, making sure we're making our plants healthy, I think is more important.
When we started this in 2018, we were kind of scratching our heads on what we need to do for fertility. So we basically pulled that information out of Canada as far as what they were doing. And at that time, we realized that those fertility rates were probably more for fiber end of it and seed production. But so we kind of went with it. And I really haven't seen any, in my field anyway, but which we have a very excellent soils, the field that we're using in, I haven't seen anything that would make me think that we're having a lack of fertility issues with our plants. Colorado, Oregon, when I've been out there, those guys are spoon feeding nutrients to their plants every day.
And they have to. It's dry.
Right. It's just, and they're watering every day, and we don't have to do that.
How do you go about vetting quality suppliers for seed, and what were some of the questions you might be looking to ask?
I would look for somebody that's been around for a while, that's reputable. You know, there's about 4 or 5 fairly large seed breeders in the United States, so those would be good ones to choose from. I would be wary of good deals. If they're wanting to move a bunch of seeds at a really cheap price, there's probably a reason that it's cheap. COAs can be all over the board. A lot of people, when the USDA came out with their THC levels, a lot of the breeders changed their pamphlets where they're showing that their COAs on the seeds that they're producing are going to stay below the 0.3. Even though you got a COA on when you bought your seeds, and that COA shows that plant, when it was breeding, the levels, THC levels stayed below that, doesn't necessarily mean that your plants are going to stay in the same ballpark. So you have to monitor that, because what I've seen a lot of guys that they had hemp strains that were testing. They had a COA last year that showed a 15% CBD level, and then the THC level was maybe at 0.37. Okay, and you might get a COA now that'll say 0.28 on THC, but a lot of times the CBD levels are going to be more like 10 or 11%. And basically what they're doing is they're monitoring their plants, and when the THC level gets close to the threshold, they're going ahead and harvesting the plant, and whatever they've got at a CBD level at that point in time is what they're going to end up with. So that's why you see some of the same strains that last year might have had a COA at 15%, but this year it might be down to 10%. And that's kind of the reason why. So the breeders are all working on getting strains to where they can get it back up to that 15% CBD level and still maintain a THC level below 0.3. You need to have the COAs, but the COAs aren't written in stone, so they're just kind of a baseline to go by. And monitoring your plants and testing is still going to be critical.
And there's questions you're going to have to ask to verify that the certificates of analysis are indeed real, that they have not been doctored in some way. Always call the lab. There will be an identification number on that. That's your first step. And then also understanding when those certificates of analysis or when those laboratory tests were taken throughout the flowering period. Very important information. But regardless, certificates of analysis are going to be your saving grace, so make sure you have them with all products as well as your license when doing any and all activities with hemp. All right, so we have our seed source that feels vetted. We feel confident in working with them. What was your experience using feminized versus conventional seed, and if you had to choose?
I would recommend feminized seed no matter what. So I wouldn't. Last year we tried to do some work with unfem seed, and we had two different. Basically, we were going to try a process of putting the plants into light depth when they were in the greenhouse and sorting through the males. Then you can do that; it does work. We just had timing issues last year where we didn't get our light depth kit in time, and so that forced us to go ahead and plant all the seedlings that we had. So we knew when we went out in the field, we had a male and a female mix. So, and we spent probably 3 weeks of constantly walking the field and cutting out males, trying to keep our pollen down as much as we could. But we still ended up with some seeds in our biomass. So I don't ever want to go, I don't think I'll ever plant hemp again and use unfeminized seed. So if you're doing a very small acreage and you're really looking to cut back on costs, you can get by with it, but I wouldn't recommend it.
So you're either paying for the costs up front with quality seed or the labor on the back end. And
exactly. And the quality of your product at the end of the year.
If you're looking to get more information on these varieties or how these production systems work, shameless promotion here, go to our website, go.illinois.edu/spotlight, and we have a really great video focusing specifically on this type of production strategy where you're growing for grain, fiber, and CBD all essentially in one go. Next question, have you tried planting hemp on prior alfalfa ground? If so, what was the result?
I haven't. I had a couple growers that we were working with last year that had hemp or had a wheat field that they went in, they baled the wheat off, and then they went in and did transplants in that field. There's advantages and disadvantages to doing that. Part of it, the advantage that you get is the wheat stubble can kind of act like a mulch, help keep weed pressure down. I've been curious about using rye or wheat for a cover crop and then rolling the wheat down and planting straight into the stubble and using the wheat for the wheat barrier. I've got a couple guys that are going to be going directly into sod this year, where they're not going to tear their field up. They're basically going to auger down a hole, put the plant in. They're going to try to mash that up with the mowers that they already have. And I think that'll be a good technique. What I've cautioned them on is if they're going to go into sod like that, they might need to put supplemental water on there just because the sod's going to pull away a lot of moisture, especially when the plant's starting out in the top few inches of the soil. So they might have to water the plants until the plants get up and going. But I honestly think it's not a bad way to do it. So because you can mow it, keep the weed pressure down. Basically, the techniques that we're doing in our field are the same, other than we're not mowing. We're just running cultivator or tiller through the field. So a mower, and they both take time. So I would say that technique would probably work very well.
Did you plant a cover crop for hemp fields? And if so, what did you plant? I'm not sure, Andy, did you plant any cover crops And hemp, no. All right. To the person who asked that question, our March 31st episode with High Plains Grains, they talk about utilizing an oat cover crop extensively. I would encourage you to take a look there to answer that question a little bit better. Knowing when to get a crop into the ground is so important. What conditions were you looking for to get a uniform stand at emergence? And was there any difference in when you direct seeded versus when you got the transplants in?
Part of what we did last year was trying to figure out what type of, how to prepare the soil for the direct seeding and what the hemp didn't like. So the first patch that we did, we basically did a tillage practice like we did with corn and soybeans. We ran field cultivator over. And then the second batch that we did, we rototilled. And basically our emergence had more to do with the soil moisture that we had to work with than anything. There was no irrigation. And when we got into the field last year, everybody remembers how wet the spring was last year. It was the first week in June before we were even able to do any direct seeding with the hemp. So the first field that we planted, the emergence was a lot better, basically because it was planted about a week to 10 days earlier than the second half of the field. And the difference was the moisture that we lost in that week to 10 days. And then we went through a dry period here on our farm from basically about the 1st of June to the 1st of August, where we received less than a half inch of rain in that 2-month period. So that had more to do with our emergence than anything. It was just that you could look down the row and you could tell the seeds that hit moisture and where they came up and the seeds that didn't hit moisture. And it was spotty. So, and that's the risk that you have with direct seeding, is you don't know what you're going to end up with for a stand when you direct seed. When you go to the transplants, your spacing is going to be where you want it. You know what you're going to have. If you're going to start out seedlings on your own, or I would recommend, okay, if you're going to start seedlings out on your farm and you're going to want to plant at around 1,700 to 2,000 plants per acre, I would still recommend starting out in the greenhouse somewhere around 23 to 2,500 plants. The emergence in the greenhouse is still going to be, it'll be better than what we're getting on direct seeding, but it still won't be 100%. Or, if your germ rate on your seeds is at 94%, you're probably going to end up with 80 to 85% of them germinating in a flat in a greenhouse. So, and that's just what I've seen.
So in your experience then here, making sure that your soil is fit and the conditions are right are better than trying to rush this in. You have the ability here with a crop that's photoperiod dependent and a high value crop like soybeans. We worry about getting them in early for biomass, but you got to be very smart about when you get this crop in to establish it, particularly if you're going to do direct seeding.
What we're going to try to do on the farm this year with the direct seeding, and hopefully next week we're going to be able to actually have the planter out in the field and do some experimenting with it. But we're going to try to make a very tight seed bed as far as making sure that we have as good as seed to soil contact as we can possibly get. So basically we're going to work the ground up as good as we can and then probably run a mulcher over it and make sure it's good and compressed, which is a lot of the way that we do our small seeding techniques when we're doing wheat or when we're doing alfalfa and clover.
Moving into in-season management here, weed management has been touted as one of the most important aspects of hemp production from a control standpoint. What was your experience like in 2019, and perhaps what are some of the strategies and equipment that you use to keep those weeds down?
In our farm last year, we had 15 acres that was underneath the plastic mold irrigation drip line underneath it, and that was the majority of what we did for weed control on our transplants. Between the plastic rows, there was about a 2-foot gap of bare soil, and we modified a 6-row 3-point mounted cultivator to where we could just run it between the plastic out in the field, which worked very well. By the middle of July, when the plants started getting too big to get the tractor through the field, all the weeding from then on was pretty much done by hand. And you had to have people out there about every day on the weeding to keep it under control. So what we're hoping with the autoflower, the fields that we've seen, that we should be able to, with the narrower row spacing and the thicker population, that we should, and these plants don't get as big, we should be able to use the cultivator for most of the weed control in the field. So that's what we're hoping. But we might still have to do some hand weeding and walking of the field too. But we'll find out this summer.
Okay, so we talk about weed management. You're getting through cultivating, obviously also hand labor, pulling through some of those males and culling through the fields during the flowering period. But any experience here talking about fertigation? You had drip line irrigation. Did you use any foliar feeding or fertigation in season, or was it all pre-plant?
All pre-plant.
Okay, so it was just for irrigation then, the drip line.
Strictly water.
Okay, great to know. All right, so in season, what were some of your experiences here with males and females, even in the even in some of the, feminized varieties that you had? What were your experiences with having to cull males, and maybe even experiences with conversion of males or females into males or hermaphrodites?
You're going to have to monitor your fields, because even feminized seeds, nobody's feminized seeds 100% female. If it's done right, you should end up with about 1 male out of every 4,000 seeds. If it's done wrong, your percentage is going to be a lot higher. Even if you do have 100% female plants out there, they still have the ability to hermaphrodite and throw pollen. So if this is your first year out, pay attention to, a lot of people last year, and the plants started going into flower, they had a hard time determining a male from a female. So being able to identify a male plant as early as possible is going to be a good skill set to have. But just because you planted all feminized seed doesn't guarantee you that you're going to have all female plants in your field. So that's going to require somebody out there monitoring and walking the fields and just looking to identify males when they go into reproduction.
Okay, so how long would you say, when did flowering start? So were you sending folks out there to start culling males, and for how long were you culling males?
We culled males for about 3 weeks. We had 3 different strains out in the field that were pretty much went into flower about 7 days apart. So we started on one side with one group for the earliest maturing strain that we had, and kept an eye on it for males, and then we keep working our way across the field as the plants came into maturity. So, and it was a daily deal. You could walk the field one day, and you might hit 50 males, find 50 males on one round walking the field, and you go back to that same rows the next day, you might hit 150. So where the plants, they're slowly going into reproductive mode, so it takes a little bit of time as they mature before you can identify the males. But definitely walking your fields, keeping a close eye on it. You might not necessarily have to do it for 3 weeks, but I would probably recommend when your plant's going into flower that you keep a close eye on them for at least 2 weeks. You're going to want to watch these plants. No getting around that.
Sure.
And most people that like growing hemp like walking the field. So.
So getting ready for harvest, outside of just oil and understanding that you have to harvest a compliant crop, what was your experience like in getting this crop out of the field in terms of a harvest prep standpoint? What were you thinking about before you even got the machines out there to start combining this hemp?
Well, basically, I guess what our main focus there before harvest was just making sure that we had the equipment ready for the hemp. What we did as far as drying, we set up a couple silage wagons where we could aerate the hemp after we dry it through the combine. And to us, you know, it was just an idea that I had, and I wasn't how confident on how good well it's going to work, but it did work out very well. But as far as if you're not going to be using a combine and you're going to be hanging and drying in that area, the best things that you want to do for prep is make sure that you have everything as clean as possible where you're going to be drying it. A lot of guys used greenhouses to dry in last year, which worked out really good. A lot of people use regular pole barns to dry in. We've used corn cribs to dry in. Basically, for harvest prep, I would make sure wherever you're going to be doing your hanging and drying as clean as you possibly get it. Keep the birds out of there. The birds love to come in to the hemp, especially if you got a little bit of seed present. So that's one thing that you want to watch out for. Birds flying in, trying to keep everything clean and sanitary as possible.
All right. So what were some of the biggest problems you had actually during the harvesting period? And actually, could you please explain to us a little bit more about how you harvested? So the crop was compliant. It was ready to get out of the field. Just walk us through your harvest process and into storage, if you wouldn't mind.
Well, okay. The way we did our harvest last year is we mowed all the plants down with a disc mower, just like we would a hay crop. And we let the plants lay in the field until the moisture level on the green leafy tissue got down to at least 15% moisture. Our biggest problem that we had last year was battling the weather. And we had plants that were down. We had a rain that came in, and it rained on the plants, and then we had snow, that followed by snow. I'd reached out to some of my guys in Colorado, and because I knew that they'd had crops out there that they'd got snowed on, and went ahead and harvested and got along fine. So when I called out there and talked to them, and they were wondering how long the plants had been on the ground, and I told them, I said, yeah, they told me that, yeah, you're probably going to lose a little bit of your CBD percentage off of there, but as long as you get the plants dried and bagged, you'll probably be just fine. So it took a lot of effort to get the plants that way. We spent one day with about 9 of us out walking the field and actually going out and flipping every single plant in the field. So after it was mowed, part that was laying on the ground wasn't going to dry out, so we basically is like flipping hay. And we did that one day, and then the next day we were able to go out in the afternoon with the combine and run the plants through and got along fine. So as far as the mechanically harvesting for extractions, the combine to me is right now the best way to do it mechanically. I know guys that ran their hemp through a chopper last year, and that when you grind up all the stalks and stems and it goes into the biomass, it will dilute your CBD level. So the good thing about running the combine is it does a really good job of separating the green leafy tissue from the stalks and stems on the plant, so that you end up with more of a concentrated biomass. And 90% of processors they're going to run the hemp through a hammer mill anyway. So the combine's really not much different than running the hemp through a hammer mill. As far as a lot of people are worried about losing cannabinoids and stuff like that doing a mechanical harvest. But for extractions, we haven't really seen that in our hemp. If you're going for smokable flower end of it, I would definitely recommend cutting the plants down by hand, hang drying them, and then hand processing them.
This is probably a good time, Andy, to discuss too a little bit that you are your own processor, so you understand the quality of the product that's coming into your processor and what you can handle for your specifications, making sure whatever processor you're dealing with and how they want that biomass is going to be critical before you even start.
Yeah.
And And here too, Andy, I mean, this is just the law of biology here, but you are adding more material when you're chopping the whole plant. And so CBD content is going to go down, purity is going to go down. But again, you are the processor, so you determine that that is okay for your end product. But many processors, they might not take it that way. So make sure you understand that from a quality standpoint. It's very important. All right, Andy, so you run it through the combine here, and you have it already down to a pretty dry moisture. Did you do any external drying after you got it out of the field? You said you had it at what, 15%? And then what was your storage and your drying and storage methods for that material?
So after we ran through the combine, then we offloaded from the combine into a regular corn silage wagon that we placed an aeration tube that ran down through the perforated tube that ran down the center of the wagon, and it had a standard grain bin fan on it. So 15% through the combine, we'd put it in the wagons, and we'd put air on the hemp then, and we'd get the hemp down to at least 11% before we bagged it. So we just left the fans on, let it air dry. We didn't have to put any heat to the plants because that 2% seemed like it went out of 2 or 3% moisture went out of the plant pretty quick just by putting air on it. After we've got the plant, or after we've got everything bagged, we place them in a machine shed, steel building. We check the bags at least once a week just to make sure that they're still staying in condition. If we have, basically what we've seen with our biomass is if there's going to be a condition issue, first thing that you're going to notice is the bags. You might put your hand in the bag and feel a little bit of warm heat in there. If you feel that, you need to get some air on those bags, and that's what we've got. Special fans and tubes set up that we can actually screw the tube down into a bag, place a fan on it, a suction fan, and we can take the moisture on down lower. Because the problem that we're running into is, it's just like storing grain in a grain bin, is when the air temperatures are cool, like what we had all winter, you don't have much issues. But when things start to warm up and you start to get a little bit of condensation action from stuff that's been sitting in a building and the temperatures are low and the building gets opened up and you get a lot of warm, humid air that comes in there, that warm, humid air, you'll have a condensation issues with the hemp. So if you're going to be storing your hemp on into the summertime period, you need to monitor your bags and just make sure that things are staying in condition. And if you have a problem with condition, it's real easy to fix. Just get some type of fan that you can place on top of that bag and be able just to pull some of that moisture out, or at least get the bag up to the temperature that we have outside so you don't get that condensation issue. Make sense?
Now that you got them into storage bags, what were the conditions like that you're keeping them in for long-term storage as you're waiting to process this material, or for a grower who's waiting to get the material to a processor?
Basically, keeping it in doesn't have to be a climate-controlled room, but basically in a dry building, and it's just like any other. It's like corn or soybeans. You have to, when you're storing them long term, you need to monitor it, keep an eye on it, and so that you don't have any condition issues. So you just can't put it in the back of the shed and forget about it. Don't do that.
Did you do any topping or pruning of your hemp plants? Do you have any experience with that, or do you plan to do that in the future?
I didn't. Some growers have. Last year I was apprehensive to do it just for the fact that trimming and pruning can maybe make the plant put out a little bit more THC. So I don't recommend it, but I know guys that have done it and seen the benefits from doing it. It might be something that we try this year, but for what we did last year, we basically had our hands full with everything that we did last year. So there'll be some more experimentation with stuff like that this year. But I don't really have a lot of experience, knowledge, or input to put on top of plants. You probably saw growers that were doing that last year in some of your travels.
I did, and you know what? A lot of them were doing this in very, very small acreage. And when I'm talking small, I mean the bare minimum to grow industrial hemp. But they also did things like trellising, and so it was a much more specialized, labor-intensive, and a lot more care put into the individual plants. But that goes back to what your end use is. That might be something that's more useful in a smokable flower industry or a smokable flower market than something that's more mechanical. Great question, though. What was your CBD percent for the varieties that you know once it was finally bagged? So let's say at harvest, what was your final CBD percent on some of the varieties that you harvested this year?
Most of our, on the low side that we had in biomass was around 4%, and on the high side was around 8%.
Okay. And again, too, that is whole plant biomass. So that's leaf, stem, stalk, and all, correct?
Correct.
Correct. All right. Did you seal the bags? What size and type of bags, and how did you seal it if you did?
Boy, I don't know the dimensions on the bags right off the top of my head. They're standard. They were an open top, super sack, basically. I want to say they were 42 by 36 was the dimensions of the bags. They would roughly hold around 330 pounds of biomass dried. What we did was we reached out to some of our corn and soybean suppliers and found out where they got their super sacks from, and basically that's where we ordered from. In that type of scenario, we had to buy in bulk, so we had a lot of super sacks that we were able to sell to the other growers around here. So our standard super sack is, unless you're going to buy a couple hundred at a time, you're probably going to spend between $15 and $20 per sack. And if you're anticipating, I would for first-time growers, I would say safely 1,800 to 2,500 pounds per acre. And if you got a year under your belt, you might be more like in the 3,000 pounds the acre. So if you're 3,000 pounds plus, it's going to take about 10 super sacks to hold an acre of biomass. So if you're shucking that down into flour, it'll be less than that. So if you're separating your flour from your leafy tissue, probably end up with a higher CBD level, but your poundage would be a lot less. Poundage per acre.
Thank you. That's some great numbers to have. What was your CBD percent before harvest? And curious if you had any CBD percentage loss during storage.
I haven't ran any CBD tests lately. The last ones I did were back in December. So, and basically the way we did that was because we had some different strains that they were all we had two strains that were harvested all at the same time. We had one of them who I think, as long as the hemp laid out on the ground, that it hurt the CBD levels on it a little bit more than it did the other strain. So that's where we're kind of coming in with the 4% on the CBD. So, and what we're finding out is when we're doing our processing and we open up a different bag, we might be getting different yields out of the process. But that's basically what we're going by right now is how many we do. We're going off our yields by how many kilos of crude oil we're getting per pound of biomass. So what we're seeing is in a few of the bags that we've got bagged, we've got probably maybe a 20%. We're not yield. Some bags are yielding about 20% less than what other bags are when we're running through the processor and pulling the oil out of it. So, and I'm part of it is strain issue, and part of it was the way we did our harvest. I think certain strains didn't like sitting out in the field as long as they did, and it hurt us on a CBD level.
It's a time where we're talking about scale. You know, this is mechanized in many aspects, and so we're going to take some quality losses at scale when we're doing it this way. And it's something you have to be comfortable with. But you're a corn soybean farmer, Andy, so you're comfortable with some scale and some loss. That's just kind of how it works.
Exactly. Since I knew we were going to be doing our own processing, that our biomass that we got at our percentages, you're a lot better off to have hemp percentages around 10% if you're going to be out marketing that to other processors. Because it's basically an efficiency for them. The processors have to maintain a certain amount of efficiency when they do a run because it costs money to run the equipment. Man hours, ethanol's not cheap, and especially when a company's doing stuff off the splits, they're doing a 40 or 60% split. If you're taking it to a processor and they're running your biomass and then you're getting 60% of the oil that comes out of there and they're keeping 40%, they have to basically make sure that they get so many kilos per run of material so that it keeps them in the black too. So like what we're doing, we're trying to take our products all the way to retail. So with what our processor is doing and what we're doing, since we're kind of vertically all integrated, this year we're getting by with running biomass that's at 6%, but I'm hoping next year that we're running more in the 10 to 12% on our biomass. But that's a learning curve that we're going through, just like everybody else is trying to learn this industry and learn this crop.
Sampling uniformity a problem for your biomass?
Yeah, it is, because the problem that you run into is the tests are expensive, and how much, you can test all day long and you'll probably come up with a lot of variables in your test. So, what we did when we were selling, we sold some biomass to some processors, and what we would do is we would run a test on the product that he was going to be picking up within, say he says, I need to do a pickup in 2 weeks. So we would go to we'd weighed out how many pounds he wanted out of a bag, and then we'd send that in and get a fresh COA on that hemp, and then that's what we use to go off of as far as price on the percentage. And a lot of the processors now, what they're ones that we've been talking to and working with, basically what you'll do, take a sample of your biomass to them. They'll run a preliminary test on it, and then when you bring the biomass to them in the bags, then they are going to they're going to do their own test on the bag to make sure that what you bring them matches up with the sample that you gave them. And then like Hennepin, they're doing an initial payout on biomass, but they're also saying if we run into, you bring me in 10 bags and a couple of those bags aren't testing what we thought they were going to be testing, then they'll probably do some type of an adjustment onto what they paid you for your biomass. It's basically like taking corn to the elevator, and they run a sample on every load for moisture, and that's what a lot of the processors are doing. It's basically before they run the product, they want to know exactly what they got going through there.
Yeah, because they have to make sure it's going to fit with what they have as well in their extraction technology. So again, this is where you need, if you can, make sure you talk with somebody ahead of time, or at least have a good idea of what they're looking for generally. What is your average extraction efficiency from the biomass oil per pound?
Well, we're getting off of our stuff. We're getting about, we're probably getting close to a kilo of crude out of every 50 pounds of biomass. And that crude's probably testing around 52% CBD.
Okay.
And it takes us per run, when we first fired up was, as started running the processor, we were losing too much alcohol on each run. And so basically what we did, we tried a couple of different techniques. We tried centrifuge to spin, try to spin the alcohol out of the biomass to recuperate more of it. And then we ended up basically designing a screw press. So as soon as the hemp comes out of the extraction machine and it's still saturated in alcohol, we will basically run through an extractor and squeeze out the rest of the alcohol out of the hemp. And that basically improved how much alcohol we were losing per run by about 50%. So that was and that's what a lot of processors are finding out, where they got CO2 or where they got doing ethanol. As much of the product as they can reclaim and keep using in the processing, it really cuts the cost down on running the process. Do your homework. Be aware that this is labor intensive. And I mean, a lot of guys thought it would be easy last year. Go in, get the field planted. You know, they might have to till or mow a couple times and harvest and everything be great. It doesn't work out that way. Hemp, you pretty much are probably going to be out in your hemp field at least once a day, every day while you're growing hemp. Just keep an eye on stuff. It's a new industry. If you're looking for any books or manuals on hemp, most of these strains, CBD strains, came straight out of the marijuana industry. So if you want a good reference book, there's a lot of them on the internet that you can get on how to grow marijuana, and it'll translate right into, as far as fertility, pests, any of that problem, it'll be in those books. So, you know, it's a challenge and it's fun. It really is an enjoyable crop to grow. Because you'll go from July 10th to August 1st, and you will just be amazed on how fast this plant grows. It'll go from knee high to 7 feet tall in 3 weeks. And, you know, it's a pretty rewarding watching that happen. So I like growing hemp.
At this time, I'd like to take a minute to say thank you to American Hemp Research and Andy Huston for joining us today. If you need to get a hold of Andy, you can find his contact information on the screen. As always, the QR code on the top right of the screen is our program evaluation. If you could fill that out and tell us how we can better serve you, our stakeholders, we would really appreciate it. Just to keep it on your radar, some upcoming programs that we have. Tuesday, April 14th, we'll continue our Hemp Grower Spotlight with Rock River Labs, and they're going to give us an overview of the 2019 growing season with regards to harvest and testing compliance, and some things and guidelines that growers should know. Registration information can be found on the page right there. And thank you for joining us this time on our Hemp Grower Spotlight. You will be able to find the recording of this webinar along with many other great production resources at our website, go.illinois.edu/hemp. If you have any comments about the series, questions for our guests, or suggestions for the next edition, I encourage you to send them over to me at palberti@illinois.edu. Until next time, thank you for joining, and we will see you then.